Hello, everyone. My name is Zack Hallock, Senior Energy Advisor here at Competitive Energy Services. I'm glad you're able to join us today for this installment of CES University, focusing on demand response and peak day. For those of you who may not know, CES University is our in-house educational arm. Throughout the calendar year, we regularly produce and share videos, articles, webinars, and actually most notably coming up is our annual seminar. We cover a variety of topics throughout the year, and when in doubt, all of this can be found on our website, competitive-energy.com. But for today, we're going to focus on demand response and really peak day. So we'll start off with a brief introduction, talking about the wholesale markets that ISO New England administers and oversees, focusing on the capacity market. We'll take a step back and talk about how our in-house program, CES Self-Help, functions, how it fits into this marketplace, and how it relates to our formal demand response programs that I'm sure most of you are aware of. We'll go through the specifics of those formal programs at a high level, and then tie it all together with the value stack on how CES Self-Help fits into this puzzle. So to start us off, we're going to talk about capacity in the ISO New England marketplace. Now, ISO New England at a really high level administers these wholesale energy markets. And you can really think about it of three major markets. You have your energy market consisting of your day ahead and real-time markets to facilitate this trading, or for the most part, people are in fixed forward contracts. They also administer the ancillary services market, addressing regulation, frequency regulation, voltage support, reserve margin, amongst a couple other things. But what we're really going to focus on today is the forward capacity market, FCM for short, and this effectively ensures that the New England grid has adequate resources to meet sufficient demand needs. Some key terms that I'm going to go over today: capacity is the ability to make or actually provide this energy and put it on the grid when it is needed. The forward capacity market is the mechanism in how ISO New England ensures that these resources are going to be there when they are called upon. And a really important term that I'm going to talk about a lot is your capacity tag. Simply put, your capacity tag is your contribution to the grid at that most stressful time of the year. And it's effectively ISO saying, here is your ticket in your contribution to the most stressful hour, and we're going to charge you for that hour throughout the following power year. And there's a little bit of a mechanism in how you actually get that capacity charge, effectively your contribution, your cap tag, the value of capacity for that year, plus the reserve margin, essentially the buffer zone for what ISO needs to ensure that it's not going to have any sort of critical failures. And effectively, that charge is split out on a monthly basis as either a line item or it's baked within your electricity supply rate. Can certainly get into more details, but for today, we're going to stick to a high level and just cover the demand management side and how you can really leverage and manipulate that capacity tag. A little bit more on the forward capacity auction. It happens 3 years in advance to ensure that we have this reliable system, because remember, ISO New England, above all else, cares about reliability. On the right here, you can see that we've actually had falling capacity rates, which effectively tells us that it is getting cheaper to have those resources on the New England grid. A few years ago, we were effectively north of $10, and this upcoming year, we're going to be south of $4. You can see over the next 3 years, capacity prices go up a little bit, but effectively are leveling out around this $3 mark. It does vary by region in New England. And again, we can get into more details following up either online or with myself directly. But at the end of the day, actions around just a few hours throughout the year can really reduce those annual capacity charges by way of lowering your cap tag. And demand response providers participate in this auction process and they allow for payment to actually flow from the top down to you, the end users. Now, taking a quick step back, let's talk about CES Self-Help. CES Self-Help is an in-house client-exclusive program where we administer notifications for information and notifications for action. We have anywhere from 6 to 10, maybe up to 12 per year. And really, it's an email notification system. And actually, most recently, we can sign up for text alerts to tell you whether or not this is likely to be a peak day. Because again, remember, we're focusing on those few stressful hours throughout the year to lower your annual energy costs. With a statistical approach and decades of industry knowledge, we've got a pretty good track record about reducing the amount of false positives and false negatives, for that matter, in this regard. So really, it's a trusted program to keep customers in the know on when that hour is likely to occur. Now, I'm talking a lot about this peak hour and whether or not we're able to hit it. And this is where some more formal demand response programs come into play. And so taking a sort of another look at New England, we're all pretty familiar with the load zones. Is sort of our smaller graph in the top left here. We know all the states are effectively their own zone. Massachusetts is spread out between WICMA, NEMA, and SEMA, but you may not realize there's a subset of those wholesale load zones called your dispatch zones. And this is where we start to get a little bit more nuanced with how these formal demand response programs apply to you. It makes sense that if you're going to have some localized stress in, say, the Springfield, Mass area, you're not going to curtail the entire western half of Massachusetts. You're going to try to mitigate that and be a little bit more efficient. And again, ISO is so focused on these emergency events, which, by the way, we've only had a handful of events since 2014. They're really trying to avoid inefficient market responses. These program signals come by way of call, text, email. It's very obvious when there's going to be a legitimate emergency demand response event. And that's where we get to the first of our two programs, our formal demand response programs in the ISO New England. I'll call it the Active Demand Capacity Resource Program. Really, the top line on our two sort of formal ISO directed programs. And I won't really want to focus on this word active. You're actively making a decision, shedding load, firing up on-site generation to reduce your stress on the grid. When there is an actual emergency, you will have a 30-minute heads up. This is a very fast program, and it operates 24/7, 365. At any point in the year, you can be called on. Now, there are different there's different seasons between summer and winter. And when there are no emergencies, noting the very few emergencies since 2014, you're actually audited for each of those seasons. So really, you have two audits throughout the year to prove that you can participate in this emergency response program. For lack of a better term, a lot of times we think about this program as the audit program, but understanding when in doubt, you may be called. How that program functions is you are paid based on the current power year's capacity value. In this case, or in this upcoming year, $3.80. And you are effectively said, hey, on that audit performance, I'm going to receive payment throughout the next year for that. I'm not going to touch a whole lot on our second program, sort of the passive or the on-peak program, because that's really for specific types of technology. And you can actually be sort of mitigated in what you can do based on what state you're in and what your local utility is. To get more information on these passive opportunities, please reach out, because you may realize that you have opportunities that you weren't aware of in the past. Taking an example of a customer who was audited this past summer, effectively they were audited in this hypothetical example on August 6th from 12 to 3 p.m. And the client utilized some pretty impressive BMS and load shedding program to actually achieve roughly a 2000 kW or a 2 megawatt reduction. This program is effectively calculated using a baseline, a trailing 10-day average of business days, so that and actually it even weather normalizes in most cases, so that you're not getting undercut by way of production. How this works for this individual is they performed in the event. Their capacity rate is like I said, the $3.80. And effectively how you get to that annual event revenue is multiplying your performance times your rate times your summer season, which for us is 8 months. And that's how you get to your hypothetical $60,800 revenue here. And so it's important to understand that even though you may have a short timeline to respond, if you can play in this market, there's massive upside potential. So again, ISO so focused on this reliability piece that they're willing to pay out large amounts of money to ensure that those resources are there in an eventual emergency. The other program that I mentioned is our Utility Connected Solutions program. This is directed by your local utility. So not all utilities are going to call on the same cadence, and they're really focused around the stressful hours on their local distribution network so that they can avoid those costly hours. Again, your local utility peak may not necessarily be the annual system peak, and that's why they're going to incentivize response on a handful of calls, not necessarily one call per season. And this is where I'll talk about targeted dispatch. Again, similar to the ISO directed program, targeted dispatch is our generic sort of response program. A key difference here, though, is that you get a day ahead notice, not a day of notice. So you can plan a little bit more. Again, there's a summer and winter season. Typical event length is generally considered equal at around 3 hours. However, you're going to get about 4 to 5 calls per season. And really, actually, most notably this past year, some utilities have done away with the winter program. So this is potentially depending on where you are in New England, this is potentially your last opportunity to play in the winter marketplace. But at the end of the day, your summer performance is averaged across your calls. So if you don't make all of your calls at 100% performance, you're still going to be able to get some degree of payout. And if you notice, your unitary value for this program is far better than your ISO New England program, whereas you're looking at $35 per kW. So this is a much more amicable program for folks, better lead time, you're averaging my performances, and you're giving me a better per unit payout. This is where a lot more folks start to see some interplay between not only the CES Self-Help program, but notices from your formal demand response provider. It's worth noting, similar to the passive ISO program, there is this Utility Connected Solutions daily dispatch. Again, this is technology specific, location specific. You're going to have many more calls throughout the year, potentially shorter calls. However, your payout is much greater. This is definitely a limited program. It's a very nuanced program relative to targeted dispatch. And if you have questions or considerations or interest here, please reach out to myself directly. We would love to give you honest and objective feedback on the opportunity here. So how do all these things fit together? I'm going to take a minute and talk about what happened this past summer with our peak day. This is where you start to see this sort of interplay between CES Self-Help and these formal demand response programs. What we have on the graph here is sort of our peak week look at a particular customer of CES that does have on-site generation as well as load shed capability. We ran into a 3-day hot streak where it was a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the 29th, 30th, and the 1st, where we kind of saw this eventual peak coming. And the load was extremely close for all 3 days across the entire ISO New England system. So all 3 days were called by the local utility. It just so happened to be, and I'm talking the scale of 100, several hundred kW or less, which in the grand scheme of ISO New England is a very tight margin. between these 3 days. It ended up being Tuesday, the 29th. And actually, even more interestingly enough, the peak hour was initially estimated to be the 5 to 6 hour. And upon settlement, after the fact, it was shifted back to the 4 to 5 hour, which is not uncommon. However, it's relatively unique and worth mentioning. This particular customer had a little bit of a misstep. You can see in their load shedding capability on Tuesday, the 29th. And they actually weren't able to shed quite as much as they would have liked to on that day. They were getting calls from CES Self-Help advising them to shed load if applicable, if they were concerned about their capacity tag. And they shed load continually over the next 2 days to avoid this hour as well. In fact, actually, over the next 2 days, they ended up net exporting for a period of time. So because of the shift in hour, this customer got whacked with a higher capacity tag than they initially anticipated, going from the 2300 kW to the 5300 kW. But they still responded. They still avoided cost, and they did it with intent. A little bit of a deeper look, and something that I thought was worth sharing with folks, was this interplay between their hourly net utility read and the actual sub-metered power plant electricity to the rest of this sort of campus that we'll call this customer. And you can see the sort of back and forth between these two lines intersecting is where they had a little bit of a misfire on some on-site generation, and they just barely missed this hour purely because of that adjustment. If not for the adjustment, they would have done far better. However, they still avoided a decent amount of costs purely because they responded. And not only that, but they generated revenue through the formal utility program by responding the next couple of days as well. So overall, this is still a great success for this customer, and lessons were learned out of how do we respond in the future. And already there's been actionable change for this upcoming summit. So as I keep mentioning, there's a value stack here. How do all these things put themselves together? And ultimately, through 4 to 6 calls per year of legitimate effort to shed load or generate on site, you can not only reduce your expected electricity rate and your expected spend on the supply side, but you can also generate revenue based on these formal DR programs. It's a natural fit. It makes sense. It's purely informative. And overall, we've had a good track record with our customers year over year reducing this load. And again, our mantra is reliability and reducing the amount of false positives. And with that background, CES Self-Help is a perfect mesh with these already formal solutions. However, if you're not aware about the formal demand response programs, it's a two-way road. And so they basically feed off each other. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Again, CES University is available on our website listed here below. As our in-house demand response subject matter expert, I'd love to talk to you, even customers or non-customers. Always happy to offer objective advice. So with that, thank you.